The Batman Arkham games are heavily renowned for their gameplay model, but there is one element of them that is somewhat criticized, and this is a consistent criticism that I've seen throughout each game that's come out, and that is boss battles. Now, the Arkham series does have some really, really good boss battles, most notably the Mr. Freeze one in Batman Arkham City, and I'll explain in a moment why that one is just so good. I don't think any of the boss battles have topped that, even the ones that have tried to replicate the Mr. Freeze boss fight, like that final Bane fight in Arkham Origins, or even the Arkham Origins DLC Mr. Freeze fight, or the Red Hood fight in Arkham Knight. And I don't know, let's quickly look at each game. Like, Arkham Asylum had some good boss encounters with Scarecrow and Killer Croc, but in regards to the actual combat encounters against enemies like Bane, Poison Ivy, Titan Joker, they left a lot to be desired. They really were not good. And people have not been shy about saying that. In Arkham City, I do think it's better, but I would say that most of the boss fights are fairly mediocre. The Solomon Grundy boss fight, it's fine. The Ra's al Ghul boss fight, it's fine. Like, there's creativity in them, there's enjoyment to be had in them, but they, again, are not necessarily S-tier or even A-tier content. They're all kind of B, C tier, except for the Mr. Freeze one, again, which is definitely S-tier, best fight in the entire series. When it comes to Batman Arkham Origins, I do agree with a lot of the majority who feels that boss battles were actually that game's strong suit. Now, I don't think any of them quite reached the peak of the Mr. Freeze boss fight, and I do think that some of them are a bit overrated, like the Deathstroke boss battle. I think it's really fun and engaging, and it looks really nice, but ultimately it doesn't test you as an Arkham player too much. As long as you know how to counter, you're going to be okay. But I don't know, there's like that first Bane fight on the hotel rooftop that I think is phenomenal. And then you have that Copperhead fight, which is actually pretty challenging. And you have the Firefly one, which, even though it's almost a copy and paste of the Poison Ivy Arkham Asylum boss fight, the set piece just works a lot better, and the fact that he's throwing explosive projectiles at you, it's just a better aesthetic than the Poison Ivy boss fight. And I would say that Arkham Origins, even though I wouldn't say any of the boss fights are necessarily in the S tier, I would say that many of them are in the A and B tier. They are all consistently good. I wouldn't say that there's a bad boss fight in Arkham Origins, except maybe the Electrocutioner one, but that one was all done for comedic value. There was nothing to take seriously about that one. In Arkham Knight, which I'll just very briefly reference, I'm not even going to put that in this discussion. I think every boss battle in that game is a C or lower. Most of the boss fights took place in a tank. Most of the main villains were able to be taken out with one-hit KOs. And the only time that you were in close combat where your enemies had a health bar, it was very simple. You just had to avoid them until you filled up your dual team takedown meter, and you just repeatedly pressed that button and kind of automatically took them down as well. There just wasn't much to it. And even though it's a shame, because Arkham Knight by far has the best free flow combat system, it has the best stealth mechanics, and I just felt like a lot of it was wasted. So let's talk about what separates a really good Batman boss battle from a really bad one. And I actually want to start with Batman the Animated Series. So even though his encounters with, Joker and Scarecrow and Mr. Freeze in that animated show can't really be considered boss battles because they're not video games, the encounters with his A-list and B-list and C-list rogues are really good. And I think that the main reason for that is both because he has to find a creative way to take them down, but also because generally you feel a lot of empathy for who he's fighting. So for example, with Mr. Freeze, you're watching Batman take him down. You want Batman to take him down, but also Mr. Freeze has been given enough of an arc that you feel emotionally invested. And when you're watching Batman fight him, you're watching it as much to see Batman save him at the end as you are to see him beat this guy up. You look at Two-Face, and as much as you want Batman to take him down and stop his criminal scheme, you also feel emotionally invested in his story enough that you really want Batman to be able to help him, and you really want him to be able to save this guy. And it's really strong narratively. And we see multiple times in that series, and something that I really like is that Batman is just as willing to put his life on the line. He does not hesitate to try and save one of his enemies as he will to fight them. He's more than willing to do what's necessary to fight, Two-Face. But if Two-Face is suddenly in danger, he's not going to hesitate. He's going to do everything that he can to save Two-Face. And that's what I think is really commendable and something that I would like to see portrayed a bit more in the mainstream, is kind of that softer side of Batman almost. I would love to see more encounters between him and children. Like, I think it's really great when he sits down and just has a heart-to-heart with a child. That's really emotionally strong. So those are some elements that I think feed into it narratively, and that's something that Rocksteady didn't necessarily do as well as, you know, some of the other interpretations of Batman. I didn't feel very emotionally connected to Two-Face in the Arkhamverse or Penguin or any of these characters. A lot of them were really just scumbags here. So going forward with boss battles in Batman games, I would love to see them really give more emotional investment to these villains and really build up why Batman is fighting them, as much to save them as to stop them from committing crime. And so that's a narrative standpoint. That's something that I think worked partially for the Mr. Freeze boss fight in Arkham City. In Arkham Origins, there is admittedly some more character development, at least on the surface level. I think Rocksteady had way more of a story arc for Batman than people realize. It was just more subtle. I'll have to do a video on that later. But Arkham Origins was way more upfront about their character development. And so I think that fed a bit into, you know, some of those encounters. Even with that said, though, the villains didn't get tons of development. It was more Bruce Wayne and Alfred and Gordon and Joker that kind of got the spotlight in that game. But that did make those encounters with Joker more interesting. Now, in regards to a gameplay perspective, I was doing a little bit of research, and one of the developers on Batman Arkham Origins actually had a really interesting Twitter post. Now, I'm totally going to butcher his name here just because I don't know how to pronounce the last name. It's Gregory Belacel. I don't know if that's a hard C or soft C, but this dude he's awesome. He follows me. But I saw this really great response to someone asking about boss battles, and he said, "We had a great direction in the design team for how to design each boss. 1, we wanted to use as much as possible the same mechanics as the rest of the game, and 2, we wanted each boss to be a sort of test of mastery of one combat mechanic and or gadget." He goes on to explain, if I remember well, we did Killer Croc has the stun beatdown and quickfire battering, Deathstroke has the counter, Copperhead has free flow combat plus explosive gel, Bane has combat building, takedown, and shot gloves, Firefly has dodge, backlog, blue grenade, and then the final Bane encounter has all the different stealth takedowns. Now, like I said, I don't think that quite did justice to the Mr. Freeze model of the stealth takedowns, but what we can notice here is that the reason that the Batman Arkham Origins boss battles work, at least in my opinion, is that each one had a specific mastery of like this threshold for learning a new gadget or a new technique. And I think that this actually would have been even stronger if this didn't have the exact same free flow combat and gadgetry system from Arkham City. In Arkham City, we'd already pretty much mastered this, so when they introduced things like the stun beatdown or the counters with Deathstroke, I mean, we already knew how to do all of this, so it wasn't much of a learning curve. I think that for people who say that this is their favorite Batman game, it would be reasonable to assume that for many of them this was actually their first Batman game, because I can see why this is an appealing idea. For each new enemy, for each new boss battle, you kind of have to adapt and learn their weakness and learn this new technique to take them down. And I think that's actually really strong. Unfortunately, I also think that there's an expense to that, which is that many of them feel very video gamey. Like I believe I mentioned the Firefly one earlier. It becomes very repetitive. The Deathstroke one becomes kind of repetitive. But I think that the strongest ones are actually the ones that require you to utilize more than just one technique. So, like he says, with Deathstroke, it's just a counter. But with Copperhead, which I actually thought was a bit of a stronger boss fight, you had to really be good at both the free flow combat and the explosive gel, and that was very challenging. With the Bane encounter, you have to be good at combat building, takedowns, and the shot gloves. And so, therefore, that made it a very interesting experience in which you had to utilize many different gadgets and many different techniques to take him down. And so, when it comes down to it, I think that the best way to do a Batman boss fight is you have to push the player to the limit of their knowledge with a certain aspect of Batman's combat. I think that limiting it to one gadget actually limits the boss fight. I think that what the Mr. Freeze one did so well was, rather than just being like one specific takedown, it was like you had to know every single takedown that you could possibly do against this guy, and you had to adapt, and you had to not take him on one-on-one. And what makes that feel so much like Batman is it's you learning this individual's weakness. You can't attack them from their strength, so you have to find this person's weakness, and that really does feel like Batman. You're strategizing on how to take this individual down. So even though the Arkham Origins boss battles, I think, succeeded to a large degree in this field, I also think that by limiting it to one particular gadget that would be effective against each character, it made it feel like it was holding your hand, whereas the Mr. Freeze boss battle, it was much more open-ended. So it would be very interesting if in upcoming Batman games they actually did the Nemesis system and gave you some prep time as Batman to recognize, okay, these are these characters' strengths. I cannot attack them with close combat, but they are vulnerable to stealth. And it would actually be interesting if there were multiple boss encounters with someone, if you went back for the second boss battle and they'd adapted, so they now know how you utilize stealth and you have to use a particular gadget to take them down. And especially if, from a narrative perspective, they've added all of this emotional investment into these characters, I just think that the boss battles would be much stronger. And like I said, I don't think that they're all bad. I think that the Arkham series has generally pretty decent boss battles, although there are some, again, truly awful ones. And I just think that it's something that requires a little bit more investment than just, oh, it's a cool encounter against this villain. I think that there needs to be a lot of creativity and narrative that goes into making one effective. So anyways, thanks you guys so much for watching. Please be sure to like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below, as always, and we'll see you guys in the next one.